Okay, we are back at it now. We're actually going to do one of these guys. And so we have circumference times altitude times thickness and integrate the whole thing. Here's our graph. Remember, our equation was negative parenthesis x minus 1, the quantity squared, plus 1, that's f of x. Now, in this case, since we're still going to be slicing it vertically, we're still allowed to use f of x. We can leave it in terms of x. We don't need the y's. So this doesn't need to change. Now that is super duper nice in the case of something where you can't necessarily isolate a variable. In this case, we technically could, but we don't want to. Now, integration symbol. Now, if it's in terms of x still, the thickness of each one of these little shells is going to be dx. So we can just put dx out here. Now, the other nice thing about dx is that helps us with our bounds, because the bounds are going to go from here all the way over to here. So bounds from here to here, and since we're using x's, it'll still be 0 to 2. And the altitude, well, the altitude is a height. So what's the height of each one of these cylinders? Each one of these cylinders is going to be exactly as tall as the equation. And the way we find that at any given x, we simply plug it into f of x. So f of x is the height or the altitude. Now, that just means we need circumference. Now, for circumference, we're going to need a circle, and that, of course, is going to be 2 pi r. But the circumference of this circle here is going to be determined by what? Well, 2 is a constant, pi is a constant, and so the only other thing that we don't have is actually the only other thing that we don't have is the radius itself. Well, the nice thing is if I'm starting here and I'm working my way this way, the radius is going to be determined by the x. The x value determines it. So in this case, scat means integration from 0 to 2 of 2 pi x, that's your circumference, f of x, that's your altitude, and dx, that's your thickness. And so in our case, we're going to say from 0 to 2, 2 pi x, put f of x in, negative parenthesis x minus 1, the quantity squared, plus 1, dx. Well, that's not too bad because this is a constant. Move it out front. 2 pi from 0 to 2, and we come up with negative x times x minus 1, the quantity squared, plus x dx, and we go ahead, FOIL that out, combine like terms, integrate it from there, and you're going to get a value. So some value for its volume. And the thing about it is, we can now find that volume, whereas here, using discs and washers, because we had the two pieces, we couldn't do anything at all. All right, so that becomes the problem here. Now, I suppose if we wanted to, the only other way we could do this with discs and washers would be to break this up. And using this square root, using both the positive and negative of the square root, and you'd actually have to find this shape first and find its volume. And then you'd have to go around and find this shape, because that would be the only way to stop it from being not a function. So you'd have to break it up here and there. But in either case, not very fun, not very pleasant. So using cylindrical shells, much, much nicer. If we were to go back and look at one of our other functions that we had yesterday, we had y equals x plus 2 from negative 1 to 3. And the time that we did, we got 1, we got 5, we got negative 1, we got 3. The one where we rotated around the line y equals 3, not y equals 3, x equals 3. The problem with that one was we had to break it into two pieces, the upper cone portion and the lower cylinder portion. Well, if I were to use cylindrical shells, this isn't a big deal to go around this axis. So here we go, scat. Again, because we're going around something that looks like a y, we're still going to slice it. We're still going to slice it vertically. So by slicing it vertically, our thickness still remains dx. Our altitude is indeed just going to be the function. So this function right here determines the altitude. So in our case, it was x plus 2. And in this case, we could also do it as one whole chunk because I can go from -1 to +3 and never have a problem changing shape, slicing it this way. It only changed shape when I sliced it horizontally. So -1 to 3. The only thing I don't have is I don't have circumference. Well, 2 pi, and I need radius. Now, this is where your radius gets challenging. If I start at -1, I actually want the entire radius to be 4. So if I just type in x, that's -1. But if I say 3 minus x, that would be 3 minus -1, which equals 4. Now let's see if it works in here in the middle. Once you get to 3, the radius would indeed be 0. So you say 3 minus 3, and that equals 0. So the radius here, the way you adjust it in cylindrical shells, is by adjusting, subtracting, and adding. So in our case, this function here is ready to go. It's going to be 2 pi integration -1 to 3 of 3x plus 6 minus x squared minus 2x dx. Very easy. One integral and you're all set. So that is starting cylindrical shells.